Hey, what's up, everybody? Waiting a few for people to filter in. But today, what I'd like to talk about during this live stream is, with everything going on in Russia, Ukraine. It's like something straight out of a straight out of a book. And as I've mentioned before, myself being a big fan of Tom Clancy, watching this whole thing unfold is just like something straight out of fiction that I've read about. But so many of the things that Tom Clancy touched on um, actually seem like they're real possibilities, which is pretty crazy because you can't imagine, um, life imitating art any more than things that were specifically written about a war of, Russia versus the West. And make no mistake, that's really what this is. It's a proxy war for the West, the NATO countries, to really, determine what the outcome is going to be for Russia in Ukraine. That being said, it's always very interesting to see, not only how that plays out on the battlefield, but what it means for our economies, what it means for, our friends in the NATO alliance, and also what it means for Russia on the back end. Because when you look at the position that Vladimir Putin's in, it's really crazy to see uh, how much the world opinion has changed, towards Russia. Again, at the very onset of this whole thing, Russia itself, Vladimir Putin himself said, we're not going to invade Ukraine. That's Western propaganda. We're just conducting exercises, et cetera, et cetera. And what do you know? A few weeks later, invaded Ukraine for the special military operation to liberate the Ukrainians, who apparently don't want to be liberated by Russia. Anyway, that being the case, it's very interesting to see that, with the amount of world pressure being put on Russia, who knows, how this really turns out on the back end. From the West's perspective, you can imagine that there's a lot of pressure, public opinion on, especially to aid Ukraine, but also on the other side too, that there's a lot of people here in the United States that feel that we should not uh, interfere in other countries' affairs that has nothing to do with us. And there, of course, on top of that, there's, a lot of people that see the money motive for war, regardless of where it is, whether it's, in the Middle East, whether it's in Europe, those kind of things. And there's truth to that, right? I mean, at the end of the day, when you look at the amount of aid that's being given to Ukraine by the West, from primarily the United States, but a lot of these other countries, Germany, Poland, have really started to step up as far as giving equipment and aid and money, those kind of things. It's interesting to see the evolution of where this is going. Primarily because from the defense contractor's standpoint, at least initially, in my thoughts, the initial amount of aid that we were supposedly giving Ukraine is paltry amount, a paltry amount. Realistically, most of it is older equipment, things that we could use, ourselves, but not likely. And these are things that the defense contractors are going to end up replacing anyway with newer technology, those kind of things. So from a strategic standpoint, I don't think it really hurts us very much. But I know that there's a lot of people who look at it as, well, that's money that could be being spent here at home for, other things that we need. For example, one of the big things that I think about too is like how we treat, our military veterans. That's always been or at least for a long time, it's been a source of criticism for us as Americans that, when our troops come home, that kind of thing, we don't necessarily, do the best we can for them, which is a shame, right? It shouldn't be like that. But, these defense contractors, where they're really going to make their money is not so much, on the front end with us sending equipment over there. It's going to be in the deals to replace all of this equipment and to keep the war going. And so if you're, especially in the stocking community, again, I would say that there's a healthy respect for conspiracy and, the bigger meaning, the deep state, this, that, the other thing. And I think that a lot of the stacking community sees it as, of course, well, they want war. It creates business for them. It's about money. It's about keeping it going. And at the same time, from a quote unquote moral high ground, it hurts Russia, which is, again, something that strategically could be good for us. But ask yourself about that on the back end. Look at what happened to the Soviet Union in the first place in the 90s. Or actually in '89, I believe, was when the Berlin Wall fell. But the actual transition to Russia, took place throughout the 90s, and that wasn't a great thing to go through, because the biggest thing there strategically was Russia has a lot of nuclear weapons. They have a lot of weapons, period. And if there becomes internal strife there because of everything that's going on, especially like economically, if they start to fold in that manner, it's basically the devil is better than the one that you don't. So those kind of things can have a dramatic impact on how these things play out over time, which is interesting to me. But I think hopefully at some point that conflict kind of settles down and just kind of goes away. I think it's one of those things that's going to be here with us for a while. But as far as a hot war, hopefully it's something that tampers down. Something that's also interesting to me, and again, life imitating art, when I think about what's going on over there with the propaganda aspect, with the, for lack of a better way of describing it, the marketing of what's going on over there, to us, the West, but then also, Russia at home. What are they saying about it? And what I think there is that when you look at, the information that is coming out of Russia from open source things like YouTube or things like that, it seems that the Russian populace is pretty confined as far as what they can and cannot watch, what they can see, what they can, what types of media they can get access to, what types of news they can get access to, which is pretty crazy. It's something that we think about here at home. A lot of people think that our media here is very restrictive, and again, it's corporate media, so they're giving you one angle or another. But the reality is that, versus something like Russia, where literally, you cannot stream outside media, you can't get outside news, it's basically the literal government propaganda. The people over there, most of them have no idea of what's, really transpiring. They can only parrot the government line because that's all they hear all day, every day, which is pretty scary. Again, compared to our standards here, which we complain about, it's completely night and day. But the other thing that's kind of interesting to me, and the kind of, I would say, scary in the long run, is what if, this war has primarily taken place in Ukraine, right? It's Ukraine is fighting for its land inside Ukraine. But how would opinions change if these attacks that are happening inside Russia supposedly by Ukraine, if they moved on into Russia itself? What if, they bombed something, the fuel infrastructure, like the real fuel infrastructure, not just the things on the border that are directly contributing to the war. But what if they went after Russia's more strategic assets? Russia, in my understanding, has a tendency to build, instead of having a bunch of things like refineries or things like that, has a tendency to build one large one that really serves, a huge purposes and dedicated area to things like that, energy infrastructure, things like that. Whereas here in the West, we tend to, build more of them in different places and kind of distribute the risk out like that. But what if there was a big attack on a Russian refinery or things like that, like a real strategic refinery or anything, or their pipelines that go to Europe or things like that? Russia could literally do that thing to themselves, claim it was Ukraine or the West, and then this whole thing escalates to an entirely different level, which is scary. It literally could, be that easy to take this to the next level as far as, being a full-on hot war between NATO and Russia versus the proxy war that it is now. Little things like that, they're a reality. They could happen. And it wouldn't take, Ukraine actually doing it. Again, this is life imitating fiction. Again, Tom Clancy, that in his books talks about Russia potentially using an inside job to stir up political favor and basically rally the homeland to the cause. And really, that's all it would take, right? If average Russians saw, let's say, some type of attack in Moscow, where it was, wow, you guys attacked us here at home. Of course, that would, even people who were on the fence about Ukraine, Russia, if they saw that thing, they may be open to changing their mind to, wow, these guys really, are attacking us now. Now we're, now it's a real war. Now it's not us attacking them. It's, it's a conflict, a full-blown conflict. And so things like this are very interesting to me. They're scary, they're interesting, but also like I have to keep an open mind of everything that's going on over there. I think both sides have a vested interest in keeping it to a realistic, conventional war, and not going too far outside the norm, because all it would take is something simple like that to be able to go to the next level, which I don't think anybody wants. The other thing with that is that from an economic standpoint, again, looking at Russia, looking at everything that's gone on with Russia, and, there are a lot of people here who don't understand just how bad it is for Russia to be in this situation, to be cut off from the West. They really don't have very many friends. Even China has not stepped up to help them. And in fact has made statements to kind of tread the midline, definitely not aligning with the West, but also not having Russia's back as far as their special operation in Ukraine. And so these kind of things, when you see like my earlier video, Vladimir Putin coming out and trying to, or the Russian finance ministry trying to come out and say, well, we're going to align, our current, or try to align our currency to gold or other commodities. Those kind of things, that's not a position of strength. That's a position of desperation. That's basically saying, we're kind of teetering on our currency being complete trash. And so we need to find some way to restore some semblance of trust. But again, as I talked about in my earlier video on Russia and potentially implementing a gold standard, which a lot of stockers, the stocking community, they always talk about the gold standard, the gold standard, the gold standard. Well, ask yourself, at the end of the day, what is the point of the gold standard? The point of the gold standard is that you could trade openly fiat for physical metals, and I don't think those days are ever coming back, especially in a place like Russia, where they can arbitrarily change things on a dime. And as far as, like, let's say, for example, you did have the ability to do that at some point. They could arbitrarily say no. And this isn't the type of populace that it is here, where, if something like that happened and people, got used to being able to get physical currency and then you changed it, overnight, people here would be up in arms. Whereas people in Russia would be more willing to accept that kind of thing because that is the world they live in. We get a lot of that too, but it's not as straightforward day and night as, it would be in Russia. In Russia, again, it's an oligarchy. It's an open oligarchy. They're not communist as far as their economic system. They are some hybrid form of capitalism. And so the rich people really do dictate what goes on. And who's the number one there? Well, obviously Vladimir Putin. But that being said, here in the United States, it's similar. It's similar. The rich people really do call the shots. Here in America, really it is the banks, first and foremost. The banks are the power players that really, I would say, make the rules and change the game as time goes on. But that being said, again, with Russia, it would be a completely different environment. And as a stacker, are you going to be the type of person who says, yeah, I would trust it. I would, gladly purchase rubles that are backed, quote unquote, by commodities and including, gold and potentially silver. At this point, they're just talking about gold. But I surely wouldn't. I absolutely would not trust that. I mean, at the end of the day, even if the United States said, we're going to go back to some type of a precious metal standard, which I would find highly unlikely, again, it would be dubious at best. Even stackers wouldn't say, wouldn't run to it and say, hey, this, I want to be in that kind of thing. It just is what it is. So those kind of things, those are things that you want to pay attention to. But all of this stuff, it does have an impact on us here at home in the United States, as well as, the other Western nations. But it's a constantly evolving thing where, even if they throw out these ideas that sound great, it's like, what does that really mean? Again, like I mentioned with the gold standard itself is not, to make precious metals, the really, something that you would go to get physical, possession of. The gold standard is there to increase your trust in a fiat currency. And so again, the medium's still going to be the fiat currency, even if, it's backed by a gold or silver. So with something like that, it makes me beg the question for people who don't like, for example, cryptocurrency. Well, what if there was a crypto that was backed by, gold or silver? I mean, hypothetically, it's possible, right? Or pegged to the price of gold and silver. Or again, these hybrid things, does it inspire confidence in you at the end of the day? Probably not, right? As a stacker, it probably does not inspire any type of confidence. In fact, at some point, what I would think would happen would be that people would actually kind of be turned off by the fact that, they were trying to, that cryptocurrencies or whatever, were trying to peg their value to something that, again, with the stacking community is very important to them. I think it would actually have, the opposite effect if things were starting to get pegged to precious metals. But even something like that, leads me to thinking about, central bank digital currency. You hear people talking about, central bank digital currency, it's the devil and it's going to be the end of, things as we know it. Yeah, no, maybe. The reality is that nobody knows how that would play out. And realistically, like the real concerns there are not so much that it's a central bank digital currency, because at the end of the day, how many dollars do you really have on you? Who keeps cash on them? Nobody. Even the bank that you go to, they really don't have that much cash on hand. You think they do, because again, you would think that you could walk in there and get your money, but it's not true. They really don't have that much cash. If you've ever seen like a bank's gold vault, gold vault, those were the days, right? Cash vault, there's not much in there. It's literally like a storage locker, like a, something you would have in an office. It's not, they still have those big safes, but the place where they actually keep the money is like a little cash thing. It's like a little cabinet. You know what I mean? It's not, you don't walk in there and there's just, I've seen it where there's carts of cash and things like that and coins and blah, blah, blah. But if you totaled it up, it's just not that much money. You know what I mean? And that's the case across the system. So because we have a fractional reserve, system for our money, again, the banks, if everybody went in to go get cash, they're gonna fold. They're gonna close their doors. It's just not possible. And that's the same thing with central bank digital currency. If overnight they decided we're going to use a central bank digital currency, for the average person, you wouldn't know the difference. Most of your transactions are electronic anyway. You use your debit card, you use your credit card, you use whatever else. How are you even going to know? Where it's really going to make a difference is like things like lending and rates, that kind of thing. Because with a digital currency, if you look at digital currencies, just like, for example, Shiba Inu or Dogecoin or things like that, they can go into the billions and trillions as far as the decimal point, as far as having value in the billions and trillions of a penny. And so because of that, that's really where the power of the central bank digital currency is. It's not that you would see a huge difference in your day-to-day life. It's more that you would see that they would be able, from a manipulation standpoint, be able to manipulate into those billions and trillions, which in an individual person, it's not that much money, but to the masses, it's a huge amount of money. And especially when you think that the United States is the world reserve currency, and that's probably not going to change, not anytime soon, but when you think about something like that, that's really how we spread that risk out. Again, with the stacking community, you hear a lot about fiscal responsibility, and it should be like, how are we going to get rid of this debt? The current system's not designed to ever get rid of the United States debt. It just isn't. So when you hear things like we're going to pay off the national debt, blah, blah, it's not meant to ever happen. Again, that risk is spread not just across us, but across all of the other nations that have the world reserve currency, for better or for worse. I mean, it's to their detriment. It's actually something that a lot of people don't realize about the United States financial system, that basically we sit on top of the rest of the world as far as our currency. And even if, again, even if they change their mind as far as, accepting that or allowing it, the enforcement arm is going to be the military. It just is. It just is. You will have a conflict. You will have, some type of strife in your country where you're not going to be able to do it. And I think that, the good example of that is Russia. Again, Russia, as much as they want to be the power that they were, the USSR, they're not there anymore. You know what I mean? And I don't think that they're, at least in their current form, ever going back to that. It's going to take some type of a rebirth from them, and trying to revive like a gold standard or things like that to attract foreign dollars with the amount of sanctions that they have on them currently. It's not going to happen. It's just not. Now, could other countries implement something like that? I think the way that it would, honestly, the gold standard could possibly return is more on a micro scale. Kind of like with the countries in South America that are accepting like Bitcoin as a recognized legal tender. It would have to be something like that more than, a large nation trying to, go against the grain. But even with that, I mean, you ask stackers about, Bitcoin being a legal tender in these countries, and they're going to laugh. They're going to say, like, no, they would never trust that because, again, it's a hypothetical for them. It's a complete hypothetical, that Bitcoin or, any of these other cryptocurrencies have actual value. Their value, for stackers, the value is derived in the physical asset, which, gold and silver are, just like real estate, just like, other commodities. But having the backing of having the physical over that period of time, again, history shows that it's proven itself time and time again. But with everything going on, in the world today, it's just very fascinating to me how